is so yeah, we're being recorded. We are hearing from in total 4 speakers with 2 video essays included. And the channel theme is national genre modes and transnational appropriations. First, we have Colleen Kennedy-Karpat, Wickham Flannagan from Bilkent University. Colleen is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Design at Bilkent University in Ankara, Turkey. Her writing has appeared in Adaptation, the Journal of Popular Film and Television, and several edited anthologies, including the films of Wes Anderson, a companion to the biopic, and her own co-edited collection, Adaptation, Awards, Culture, and Value of Prestige. Her monograph, Rogues, Romance, and Exoticism in French Cinema of the 1930s, won the Northeast Modern Language Association Book Award. Colleen's most recent work includes a special issue of Adaptation on the topic of adaptation and nostalgia, which was published in December 2020. She studies national and transnational cinemas, media adaptations, stardom, and film genre. Wickham Flannagan is an instructor in the Department of Communication and Design at Bilkent University as well. His interests include new media art and film history, specifically the symbiotic relationship that we have with our digital screens. He has made several experimental short films, including an online exhibition entitled Translation, about his alienating move to Turkey from the United States. He has also participated as a cinematographer, editor, and sound designer in various short film projects, including a video essay on the film Seconds. His latest works are primarily installations, including Magic Mirror, which was featured in the Convex exhibition at the Jankaya Municipality Contemporary Art Center in Ankara. Next, we will hear from Nicolás Medina Marañón, member of the film department at the University of Groningen, where he teaches courses in film analysis in the Arts, Culture and Media Bachelor's program. And finally, we hear from Max Bledstein, who is a PhD student and a casual tutor in film studies at the University of New South Wales. His work has appeared in Inks, Overland, The New Americanist, and Jeunesse. He has taught courses in visual media and composition at the University of Winnipeg and Brandon University. His thesis examines appropriations from Western genre films in contemporary Iranian cinema. We will hear one paper after the other and have the questions at the end. Each paper will be 20 minutes long, or indeed video essay will be 20 minutes long. Okay, so Colleen and Wickham, if you could start us off, please.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. So we wanted to kind of use this time at the beginning to sort of introduce our kind of interest in the subject matter of our video essay to give a bit of context. Colleen, if you want to start with that, since this was primarily your sort of inclination based on your French studies background, French cinema studies, you approached me. Do you want to take it away?
Sure, yes. Thanks, Elka. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this morning. It's really an honor to kick off the proceedings for today. So yes, as Wickham said, this was kind of my impetus to do this video essay. And nostalgia is a particularly fruitful framework to be doing this. I mean, I've been a fan of The Big Lebowski ever since the late 90s. Which dates me horribly, but that's just the way it is. I mean, not to the point where I've ever been to a Lebowski fest, or, you know, I'll have a White Russian while bowling on occasion, you know, in better times, but that's about the extent of participation in fandom. But when I ended up watching several films from Bertrand Blier as a part of my French studies, as Wickham mentioned. You know, I came up through a French department, so my focus has always been French film history. And Blier had a very big part in this, and it was a big part of film in the 1970s, and particularly this movie Les Valseuses, which we referred to in the video essay as Going Places, which was its Anglophone title. So this was a really big part of my formation in that department. Right around the year 2000, there was a big kind of resurgence of Blier in French film studies. That's where most of the scholarship on his work would date to. And so anyways, I watched it in the mid 2000s or so, not really thinking much of it. I have the DVD in my collection in case I ever wanted to teach it. And then when rumors started that John Turturro was actually making his Jesus Quintana spinoff happen, I thought, well, that seems ill-advised. And then I read the headline that he was making it as a remake of Les Valseuses. I thought I was hallucinating. I couldn't believe that this was actually happening. So I knew from that moment that it's a rare thing when all these disparate strands of a single career kind of come together in one highly improbable text. I knew I had to do something with it. And so this call for papers came. I invited Wickham to join me. I think this is probably the most fruitful application of these different strands that I can think of. And it's just been a real pleasure to put this together. We are still working on it. This is not the final cut by any means. So we really invite you to give your full feedback. You can email us after the fact. It is too long, unfortunately, to show it in its entirety in the time that we have allotted, but we do invite you to go back and watch it and contact us later as we go through the final incarnations. Yeah. So Wickham, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just a bit of context for me. Primarily I'm doing a lot more sort of video production, specifically kind of like she said, thank you for that. The kind of installation work that I'm doing, but I had my undergrad in sort of film studies. And so I've always been sort of fascinated by specifically the nature of these remakes, specifically kind of shot for shot remakes and why they exist and why they need to exist. And so I had never seen Les Valseuses. I was brought up on the traditional French cinema of, French New Wave, not to say that Les Valseuses isn't traditional, but just the kind of basic stuff, the Godards and Truffauts of the world. And so thank you, Colleen, for opening my eyes to this, this whole subgenre that I had not been super familiar with. Obviously, Big Lebowski, like most people, watching this random Coen Brothers movie, being shocked by how charming it was, and it's sort of taken off from there and become this kind of cultural phenomenon, as you all know. And watching the Jesus Rolls, what was amazing to me was just how I take a different approach, where it didn't feel like this lightning in a bottle to me. It felt like this, like John Turturro was this fan, and he was like, well, no one's seen this French movie. I'll just do that, and that will be my offering to the world. And in the video essay, we directly call attention to the Psycho remake, the shot-for-shot Psycho remake. You could also put Haneke's Funny Games in there. But just the notion of why a shot-for-shot remake exists and what it brings to the table, I find that element of it fascinating, just the notion of like how cynical or how self-serving or how much of a vanity project is it to just take something that someone else did and appropriate it for your own nostalgic spin-off needs. And that's one of the reasons why we chose the Jesus Rolls for our subject matter. Is to both of us, it's this weird thing, it's this anomaly. We were discussing it this morning, just like, when has there ever been a spin-off movie that is also a remake? There's probably examples of that, but the amount of love that Turturro clearly has for Bliér's original film knows no bounds when you watch it. But it's just so remarkably odd that it is so indebted to this older kind of bygone era movie. All of this is explored and more in the video essay. Yes, we would very much appreciate any and all feedback. It is a bit too long right now, so we're trying to find areas to kind of streamline it. But what we will watch now, as I sort of pivot to the essay, is the sort of introduction to kind of our thesis, our argument, and we kind of cut it off right as it gets into the misogyny and comparing the two sort of misogynistic overtones of the two films, because Blier, has that reputation in the movies. And so it gives you a basic sense of what we're talking about here, which we've illuminated already. So if y'all want to take it away and click on the link. What did we say, Colleen, like the first?
About 10 minutes, 10.5 minutes. If you see the train sequence, you've gone too far. You probably need to be back.
Yes, once things start getting sexy, for lack of a better word, you've gone too far. So everyone, thank you all.
Movie, Wickham.
I know, it's the whole movie. Thank you all for tuning in. Yes, let's check it out.
I believe Shelley is now providing us with the shared screen, aren't you?
That should be accessible to everyone, is it not?
The link, yes, I see that.
Yeah.
So I hope that you have all been able to watch Nico's video essay, which I thought was similarly fascinating as Colleen and Wickham's. So we now turn finally to Max, who will present a more traditional paper, I believe.
I'm just going to share my screen, so I want to make sure you all are with me. Do you hear me so far?
I hear you, yes.
And do you have the presentation?
Yes, we can see the presentation.
Okay, great. The Iranian film Girls' Dormitory gives the much derided horror subgenre of the slasher a new lease on life. Since the slasher's 1980s heyday, it has been critiqued for being repetitive and formulaic, as well as offering little in the manner of political substance beyond vapid endorsements of Reaganite neoliberalism. This repetition led to a number of films in the mid to late 1990s, exemplified by the Scream franchise, that highlighted and satirized the subgenre's conventions. Unlike those films, Girls' Dormitory returns to many of these conventions without the generic self-reflexivity. Instead, Latifi reinvigorates the subgenre by bringing it into a new cultural context. This becomes most apparent in the use of the common setting of a university campus. Whereas the campus had been one of many slasher tropes to be parodied, in Girls' Dormitory, it becomes a location for the working through of the very real cultural anxieties concerning Iranian women's place in universities in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Girls' Dormitory engages these concerns by drawing on what Michael J. Coven called
Max, you've muted yourself accidentally. You have to respond. You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry,
you hear me
Matt,
now?
that was me, sorry.
Okay.
So
Sorry,
you
sorry. Great organizer, sorry.
Where was I?
yeah, that first paper, you were on that screen and you kind of were just about to move into the next screen.
Okay, I'll just end with the last couple sentences. In contrast to the claims of reactionary politics in the earlier slashers, Girls' Dormitory's social script engages seriously with the issues facing female students. I argue that this engagement demonstrates a unique revival of the slasher, a subgenre otherwise being parodied, rethought, or ignored at the time of the film's release. Girls' Dormitory tells the story of Roya and Shirin, two young Tehrani friends who moved to the small village of Sadeh-Ku to attend university. Their parents resist them going at first, and Roya's parents only agree once they decide that Shirin's brother, Farhad, will drive the women there. Upon arriving, they learn that due to the girls' dormitory on campus being under construction, they will have to stay at a boarding house off campus run by the elderly local caretaker, Sakina. The boarding house is next door to a rundown mansion, which Sakina warns the two women not to enter due to it being inhabited by jinn, who have been responsible for the disappearances of a series of brides. Roya and Shirin ignore Sakina's warning and find inside the mansion not jinn, but Kobad, a mentally ill man from the village. After he kills Sakina, revealing that he has also killed the brides, police close the university for investigation, forcing Roya and Shirin to return home. As Roya prepares to marry Farhad, she becomes, as a bride-to-be, Kobad's next target. Girls' Dormitory depicts this narrative through the horror subgenre of the slasher. Numerous elements of it appear throughout the film, including the campus setting, Kobad as the mentally ill killer, Roya and Shirin as helpless female victims, and Sakina as a maternal figure. Coven's comparison of slashers with urban legends on the basis of their shared function as social scripts helps to explain the relationship of Girls' Dormitory to its cultural context. Coven notes that the survival of both slashers and urban legends, quote, scars the narrative's protagonists at the point of diegetic closure, end quote. The observation of this common trait facilitates Coven's analysis of similarities between the two, both of which work as, quote, scripts for debate about what a society/culture believes to be true or at least possible, end quote. As Carol Clover and many other scholars have noted, the possibilities most frequently addressed in slashers are those of violent retribution for sex. Indeed, Clover describes the deaths of the, quote, those who seek or engage in unauthorized sex as a generic imperative of the slasher film, end quote. Coven problematizes this description by also noting the emphasis on adolescent responsibility in the social scripts of films such as Halloween and Friday the 13th, in which errant babysitters and camp counselors receive punishment for abdications of duties of care. These acts of retributive violence can undoubtedly be read as having ideological functions. For example, Veredika argues that slashers demonstrate for viewers, quote, how self-awareness, a more conservative stance in personal and sexual matters, and the readiness to use violence are once again the attitudes that will best ensure survival, end quote. Dika associates these demonstrations with the reactionary political climate of the Reagan-era US. I contend that the social script of Girls' Dormitory has an even more direct relationship with cultural conversations in Iran in the late 1990s and early 2000s around homosexuality, heterosexuality, and women's place in universities. Girls' Dormitory uses the qualities of the slasher to offer an incisive look at the significance of homosexuality in higher education for Iranian women. As Nima Naghibi explains, the depiction of women-only communities has been a significant theme in post-revolutionary Iranian cinema. According to Naghibi, films such as Tahmineh Milani's Two Women and The Fifth Reaction depict, quote, socially transformative possibilities through the creation of temporary homosocial spaces, end quote. As both films also show, these possibilities become disrupted by, quote, the heterosocial imperative, which enforces an oppressive and hierarchical model of social relations, end quote. My subsequent close reading of Girls' Dormitory will emphasize the ways in which the film shows both the opportunities for transformation and the disruption Naghibi describes. Naghibi's analysis of homosociality draws heavily on the work of Afsaneh Najmabadi, who provides frameworks for understanding the specific homosocial sites seen in Girls' Dormitory, the eponymous female-only housing for the university in Sadeku. Najmabadi notes the particular significance of education for the dissolution of Iranian women's homosocial spaces as part of the, quote, immense shift, end quote, towards modernity in the early 20th century. For Najmabadi, schools and the books taught in them were crucial spaces and texts for the change, which also associated heterosociality with progress and homosociality with the past. Although much happened between the time Najmabadi describes and the early 2000s setting of Girls' Dormitory, questions about homosociality and its relationship with women's education maintain a central role throughout. My reading of Girls' Dormitory draws on Najmabadi's understanding of Iranian homosociality in the early 20th century. Najmabadi proposes that in this period, quote, Iranian modernity insisted on a regime of compulsory heterosociality that was to underwrite normative heterosexuality, end quote, in contrast to the earlier prevalence of homosocial spaces. Najmabadi chronicles the disciplinary effects of the move towards heterosocial interaction, which, quote, rescripted women's language, reconfigured women's bodily presence in public, and recorded women's wisdom and knowledge, end quote. As evidence of women's discourse prior to this shift, Najmabadi cites Bibi Khanum Astarabadi's text, Vices of Men, which, she argues, demonstrates that the discursive style of women's homosocial spaces drew on, quote, a language of feminine transgressive irony that was later to be rescripted as vulgar and rejected as backward, quote. According to Najmabadi, then, the prohibitions on women's public expression that came with heterosociality restricted the relative discursive freedom facilitated by homosociality. In Girls' Dormitory, women's discussion of jinn epitomizes the freedom of the homosocial space. Sakina first tells Roya and Shirin about jinn haunting the mansion after Farhad drops the two friends off. Once he leaves, allowing the women to be alone, Sakina approaches the camera, walking from a medium shot into a medium close-up, then warns Roya and Shirin with a menacing tone. The building has jinn. In the following scene, in which Roya and Shirin are alone in their room, Shirin expresses her fear of the jinn to her friend. The conversation topic changes when Shireen picks up the cassette Farhad has made for Roya and asks her why she will not marry him. Although Farhad does not appear visually in this scene, the mention of him leads to the women no longer discussing the jinn, as if his male presence interrupts the conversation. This pattern reappears when he does show up on screen once again, in a scene where he surprises Roya by appearing at the dorm in the middle of the night. Immediately prior to his entrance, Roya, Shireen, and their female housemates discuss the possibility of the building being haunted, then stop once he arrives. Although they ask him if he worries about the jinn prior to him entering the mansion with Roya, he brushes off their concerns, telling them that he is an exorcist. According to Pedram Partovi, part of the reason girls' dormitory was acceptable to Islamic authorities was, quote, the general association of the beliefs and practices of popular Islam with the feminine, end quote. The sequences I just discussed illustrate manifestations of this association in the film, as well as women's subsequent ability to discuss jinn when men are not present. Partovi correctly notes that, quote, it is largely women who believe in, talk about, and are the victims of jinn in the film, end quote. Indeed, as Najma Badi explains, women's wisdom and knowledge, which they could share more freely in homosocial environments, became circumscribed by an increase in heterosocial interactions. This dynamic can be seen in girls' dormitory through the women's contrasting willingness to discuss jinn when men are not present, as opposed to when they arrive. The depiction of homosocial freedom in the context of a university environment epitomizes how the political complexities of homosociality and heterosociality intertwine in contemporary debates around female university students in Iran. As Najma Badi notes, such debates could perhaps be traced back to at least the early 20th century. However, the issues most relevant to girls' dormitory concern women's scores on the Concours, Iran's university entrance exam, beginning in the end of the 20th century and continuing into the present. 1998 was the first year in which women outnumbered men in passing the exam, comprising 51% of successful applicants. This led to calls in the early 2000s for gender quotas, in which half of university students would be reserved for men, though the initial proposals were opposed by feminist activists and defeated. Meanwhile, women's success rates on the Concours continued to rise, as they became 62% of successful applicants in 2002. A quota for female students did not arrive until August 2012, nearly 10 years after the release of Girls' Dormitory, at which point women were restricted from 77 fields of study across 36 universities. Prior to the quota's imposition, however, women's presence in universities was the subject of much debate, illustrating another example of the politics of gender segregation in Iranian culture. According to Faigeh Shirazi, conservatives have described, quote, the widening of the gender gap in favor of women as a social dilemma, end quote, whereas women's rights advocates have argued that regulations aim to keep female students even below 50%. The significance of the slasher and the film's approach to political issues can be seen in the intrusion of male characters into women-only spaces. Kobad both embodies the archetypically mentally ill murderers of the subgenre and takes on particular implications as a man intruding into the women's homosocial space. This intrusion epitomizes Najma Badi's description of men's relationships with women in heterosocial spaces. According to Najma Badi, in these environments, women's presence, quote, was immediately contested and policed by men's flirtations, end quote. Najma Badi argues that the freedom of homosocial spaces became invaded by male intrusion. Likewise, in girls' dormitory, the women's relatively unencumbered discussion of jinn gets attacked by the very real presence of a male villain. Although Farhad's appearance is more benign, he still inhibits the female character's ability to express themselves. As a man entering a female homosocial space, he impedes the women's freedom. Such an impediment can be seen in the film's juxtaposition between marriage and study. Latifi suggests this dichotomy perhaps most clearly when Sakina first explains the history of disappearing brides. She touches Roya's face with affection as she warns her, be careful. The camera tracks in towards Roya's look of concern to emphasize the urgency of the situation. The film cuts from a close-up on Roya to an image of a wedding photo album. As Farhad flips through it, he explains to his parents that he wants them to ask Roya's parents for permission for him to marry her as soon as possible. Thus, Latifi emphasizes the contrast between Roya's homosocial spaces at university and the impending heterosocial intrusion of marriage. The marriage becomes hastened due to a different man, Kobad. The university closes after he kills Sakina, forcing Roya to return home and leading her to accept Farhad's proposal soon after. Prior to the killing, Roya's parents encourage her to marry, to which she responds that she wants to finish studying first. These plot points illustrate the perspective towards university and marriage of many Iranian women. University is often seen as a way to delay marriage. Mitra Shabarini explains that following high school, quote, Iranian women are faced with two alternatives, to get married or to delay marriage by going to college. Roya clearly worries that her ability to do the latter will be threatened by saying yes to Farhad. However, once Kobad attacks and she loses the opportunity to postpone marriage, she subsequently agrees to the proposal. Roya's relationship with Farhad further connects girls' dormitory with real-life dynamics of university in Iran, which can likewise be seen through the titular dormitory itself. When Roya and Shirin first arrive in Sadeh-Koo, they learn that they have to live off campus due to the women's accommodation on campus being under construction. This plot point can likewise be found in the 1979 slasher, The Silent Scream, in which the unavailability of on-campus housing sets in motion protagonist Scotty's attack at the hands of the custodians of the off-campus housing in which she stays. However, like the other borrowed elements found throughout Girls' Dormitory, the narrative beat takes on particular implications in the Iranian context. Indeed, as Partovi explains, the ongoing construction of the dorm suggests that the university has been, quote, recently established to handle the crush of new and especially female students from the post-revolutionary generation, end quote. This issue became even more pressing in the years following the women's release. According to Nazanin Shahokni, during 2008, in which women's share of university admissions reached a record 66%, quote, the government was not able to expand women's dormitories and residence halls, end quote. Sanam Vakil describes universities as being slow to build accommodations commensurate to the increase in female students from the late 1990s onwards. Furthermore, the solution Roya and Shirin do get is hardly adequate. The ceiling leaks and they live next door to a killer. Thus, the fantasy of the film evokes very real issues for Iranian female students. Due to Kobad's attack, the university becomes an impossible place for Roya to be altogether, and she returns home. Campus closes, and shortly after, she accepts Farhad's proposal. The sequence of events emphasizes the dichotomy between marriage and study for Roya. Once she can no longer be a student, she embraces Farhad. Her leaving of the university and subsequent kidnapping by Kobad mark important contrasts with typical slasher plots. As Dika notes, the narratives are usually set in motion either by a killer traveling to a place where a group of young people are, or a group going somewhere with the killer. However, in the case of the latter, quote, once the young community has arrived at that setting, there's little movement into or out of it, end quote. The closing of the university precludes Girls' Dormitory from adopting this narrative pattern. Instead, Roya leaves, then Kobad brings her back to the campus. This clear deviation from slasher conventions shows an important example of Latifi's adaptation of the subgenre for the Iranian context. Like the many universities that have been unable to accommodate female students, the campus at Sadeh-Koo is an inadequate place for Roya and Shirin to study. The depiction of this inadequacy in Girls' Dormitory exemplifies the ability of slashers to function as social scripts. Whereas many earlier slashers offer scripts about more universal themes such as premarital sex and adolescent responsibility, Girls' Dormitory tackles political issues specific to its sociocultural milieu. As I have shown, Latifi crafts a social script about female university students and homosocial spaces, two topics with a number of points of overlap. The deft navigation of these issues in Girls' Dormitory revives the slasher. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Max. That was 20 minutes, so fabulous. So can I invite questions, please? So either pop them in here or put there's a hand up option. There's a reaction with applause. Maybe actually we can all offer our applause to the speakers because these were three very interesting papers. So thank you. And yeah, if you could basically indicate you want to ask a question, please.
I have a question. Is that all right?
Please go ahead. Sorry, Wickham.
No, you're fine. A couple for y'all's presentations. I enjoyed the video essay very much. Nico, I was going to ask you, this notion of nostalgia kind of based on our cultural experience, sort of being drawn in. I really like the analogy that you made of, not analogy, what literally happened where you looked at your mother and you had that sort of shared experience. That was very, very nice way of thinking, because we have that when we watch movies with our parents. I was curious, like, what role class plays into this, because it feels like there's a natural sort of authenticity to these sort of lower class representations. The kind of the grit of the mise-en-scène, the kind of lived-in quality of it. And I was imagining other sort of, maybe more higher class reflections on nostalgia, where maybe even the director does not live in this era, but is nostalgic for this period, sometimes in a satirical way. Usually there's some form of commentary, but you mentioned kind of positive and negative representations. I think of things in terms of movies, so I apologize, like Age of Innocence, or like The Leopard, Visconti's The Leopard, like these movies that exist to kind of bask in this world. And obviously they have their own little narratives. Leopard, for the most part, nothing really happens except you're just sort of along for this kind of experiential ride. You mentioned this kind of documentary approach, but I was going to ask you kind of twofold, this outsider kind of viewing things almost as a documentary, but is class that important to this term, Costumbrist, if I'm saying that, I don't remember. Is class that important to it? And is there a way that filmmakers can kind of draw us into the collective nostalgia of, say, 1870s New York and like Age of Innocence, where he's clearly not lived in that period, but he has this kind of nostalgia for the Edith Wharton book and that kind of vibe. I was wondering your take on that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And yeah, you pronounced the term correctly. And the thing is that costumbrism in itself, originally, it was usually focusing indeed of the working class, lower classes. So that was indeed a characteristic defining that. And most of the productions, I mean, I use this term because in Spanish criticism and cinema criticism is used a lot to refer to national productions, but also international productions. And there is a pattern because, well, apart from the films that I mentioned, in the case of Almodovar, a lot of those, they focus on this idea of on lower classes, let's say, and the contrast with higher classes. But if you think of, I'm thinking, there's a lot of situation in which the cinema of Ken Loach, for example, is also described as costumbrism. And I think there's also a view always, right? A way it's used, I think, as a framework to look at usually, struggles, I think, in classes. So in that sense, if I think of all, if all the examples that I can think of, there's always, an attachment, an association with class, but also in the sense of like, it's very specific in the sense of like working class or lower classes. I guess because this is very subjective. I mean, the category, I hope that the categorization can resonate, but of course the illustrations, they cannot resonate necessarily. I mean, each person will choose a different illustration for those. So I guess there could be examples of more of like a nostalgia for higher class. But yeah, I guess that's something that I personally cannot relate a lot. But again, I guess it's a very subjective thing. And also the fact that you mentioned Visconti, because talking about this, another example that I mentioned, Alice Rohrwacher, which does a cinema that is sometimes compared with the neorealism. And I think in the case of Visconti, it can be slightly problematic because some of the things that were criticized from his work, right, was that he was focusing on working class, but he came from a very like bourgeoisie background. So yeah, there's a bit of problematic in there that I guess didn't really enter much into, but it's definitely in there. And there's a lot of also the fact that I kept bringing up this Spanish thing. I also had the fear that could be read in a slightly absurd, like nationalist way, but it's just because it's a subjective thing, right? So it depends on the experience of each person. And yeah, you also asked about the.
Well, I think this relates. What my point was, and I think this just relates to how immersed we get into movies. And maybe I'm fooling myself and thinking that I feel nostalgia for something that I would have no experience with. Another thing that some of the movies reminded me of was something like My Neighbor Totoro, like that sort of like being on a farm, with your sister. I've never been in that situation, but I find the nostalgia, Miyazaki, right, that he brings to that movie infectious. I feel like I've had that shared experience, even though I haven't. And I was wondering if that is just, if a movie can evoke these kind of nostalgic feelings almost disingenuously to your viewer, just by the strength of that kind of, the authenticity and strength of that kind of past experience. Or is it always, on some level, we're just sort of witnessing it kind of in a detached way if we haven't had that shared experience, I guess, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, the thing is that I also was hoping, but I realized that I'm very bad at editing text into video. I was hoping to actually be able to have more things, but the last part is already quite rushed. But I'm saying this because in the last part I was kind of like thinking about, okay, Costumbrist, but what could be the approaches? I mean, what could be the use of including this in filmmaking? So I share your ideas that you have of the Totoro and Miyazaki, for example, and I have a sort of a distinction. For example, in the example of My Mother and Volver, as I was going over and over the editing, I realized that I'm building a nostalgia. I mean, kind of like leaving her nostalgia, but I really didn't experience that past the same way that she did. But there's certain like closeness in geographical terms. So, okay, I could kind of understand that. But then in the case of, for example, what I also mentioned, Corrida, I also have this weird idea that I kind of also develop a nostalgic attachment to something that is very far away from me. Also not in terms of geographical closeness or separation, but also in the experience. And I think, yeah, one of those classifications that I wanted to make is, on the one hand, I think they can do this for the sake of like expecting that you are like having certain evocations. So if you lived these things, but also I think there's also this type of cinematic contemplation, which I think is a bit of what maybe Miyazaki or Corrida does with this. And in the way that the style is used, I think can sort of create or trigger this attachment with the film. I don't know if that sort of answer. Or...
Yeah, thank you. That's cool.
Actually, I'm going to use the opportunity to ask my question, because I had a question for all of your speakers, actually, which is precisely about this nostalgia for the thing that is so far away from us, the transnational experience of nostalgia, in a way. With the Iranian film, obviously, it draws on the a very American genre in many ways in order to tell a very particular Iranian story. And then, one of the things that struck me about the video essay by Colleen and Wickham was precisely this wish to embrace a past through an experience of a French kind of cinema, and then mixing that with the American experience, which I thought was really quite complex. And then obviously, your experience, Nico, was you're sitting in a cinema surrounded by people who haven't had that same experience as you, who couldn't connect to the film in the same way as you. And then you're also using quite a lot of Japanese examples in your video essay in order to make your points. So the question that I have, in a way, is how much of this nostalgia is actually not about a real past. I mean, it never is. It's an idealized past, as Nico rightly says in his video essay. But how much this is about an imagined past that is actually placed and displaced from our own experience in a way. So this is a question for all of you.
I'll start if that's okay. Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that I find most fascinating about this film is that it takes this genre that in the North American context is so coded in nostalgia, sort of like Scream onwards and possibly earlier. And in the last part of this paper, I do sort of like extended comparison with all these late 90s, early 2000s slashers, which in all of these ways are kind of like consciously drawing on our nostalgia, if only to reverse it. And sometimes it's very purposefully sort of like taking something that we expect from the genre and then surprising us by doing the opposite. And this is a film by someone who loves slashers very dearly. I think that's very apparent, and that comes through in every frame of it. But it's not made with that same kind of consciousness of the audience nostalgia. Some audiences would be nostalgic for the slasher, but in general, less than North American audiences, I think it's fair to say. And so rather than this sort of like obsession with saying things like, what's your favorite scary movie? It uses this subgenre to kind of draw on this ability to poke at cultural fears, essentially, which is what it does so well. And so I think it's one that has a kind of engagement with nostalgia, and certainly you see it on the part of the filmmaker. But for the audiences, it feels like the intention is much less an evocation of nostalgia than it is a sort of desire to speak to where the audience is at the time of the film.
I was going to ask you about that, Max, here in a bit, but to answer your question, I think I just can't help but see the cynicism in relation to the Jesus roles. Like, it feels like such a transplantation of his own nostalgia, but it's the commodifying of the Big Lebowski nostalgia. Like, he is using that to sell his own version of what he loves. And that, to me, it feels very problematic, because he's selling a false bill of goods. And to me, it's this sense of like, well, he can't just translate that. He has to make his own version of it that gets rid of, you continue watching the essay, he gets rid of all the problematic stuff from the original text. So he's not really adding anything new to it. He's just saying, hey, everyone, this is a cool thing that I love. You should love it too. I'm also Jesus. Like, that feels like totally ancillary to the point. So to me, it's a sort of something of a failure. I mean, Colleen, who's just now joined us because she's having, Colleen is approaching it from a very different perspective of like, ooh, someone likes this movie like I do, right? And so then it feels more kind of mutual in that kind of nostalgic fulfillment of like, I thought everyone did. I thought no one knew about this movie, but you're sort of championing it now. And restorative nostalgia is more kind of positive spin of taking this and celebrating it and championing it and using his character to sort of get people in seats, though that seemed to fail for him, did not do very well. But Colleen, did you have anything you wanted to add in terms? Oh, nope, she got blipped out again. Sorry, Nico, sorry, you want to take it away?
Yes, I guess to answer what Elke asked, and the fact that I included also these Japanese examples were also because I was first talking about the Costumbrist, right, and the categorization, the experiential structure. So I was trying to place, and again, myself in this case, in the other end of the spectrum that I was talking with the recognition or not recognition. But I think indeed, as Wickham was mentioning before, I do sort of develop a bit of nostalgic attachment to that, and I guess it has to be with the mood, with the affective character that those films sort of create at the end, the trigger in me. So I guess that's why that specific nostalgic attachment is created. It's created to that one, and I don't know if it's. Well, because I was thinking of when Max was talking about this idea of the relation to nostalgia being different also reminded me of a point that I thought was interesting in some of these examples of nostalgia, of nostalgic, well, not very nostalgic thing. I don't consider it nostalgia thing, but they could be understood nostalgic if we think of this concept of, you talk of restorative nostalgia, but then you have like the reflective nostalgia, right? Like the one that it looks back with to certain past, but there's not really a nostalgic attachment in the traditional sense, but it's more looking back at those with the idea of like subverting a bit that, or to try to draw some lessons from that past to try to turn them into potential futures, or if we could call it like that. And I think that the example that I again included, but I didn't have time to develop, was the case of Lázaro Felice, which I think it does this very interestingly in making use of a look to the past, and then introducing some magical realist elements in the film. It does a very literal juxtaposition of past and present. And the depiction, what I call a very costumbrist depiction of the past, I think it works there to make this juxtaposition all the more effective. So I think there's an interesting use of all nostalgia within this.
Great, thank you. Do we have other questions? I know that Wickham had another question for Max, didn't you?
Yeah, Max, I'm very intrigued by this topic because for being a fan of horror movies, but there's also a paper, I think, in Turkey, you know, watching a lot of, this is tangentially related, bear with me, but like the notion of the exorcism in kind of Islamic culture is so radically different, obviously, than the exorcism in American culture and in Christianity, and just sort of seeing the distinction, just seeing the horror movie trailers for Turkish horror films is so intriguing, just in that kind of notion. But I was wondering, in relation to Girls' Dormitory specifically, you mentioned how it has these kind of hallmarks that sort of allow it to be made, or at the very least make it less sort of incendiary, because it's sort of trading on this kind of Islamic touchstones of, you know, this kind of female-centric discussions, but then you have the kind of reflective nature of the women dorm being a relatively kind of new discussion, or a very kind of timely discussion. Do you find that this movie is subversive at all, in the sense that it is trading on those fears, but is it more just representative, and it's more of an interesting kind of curiosity in terms of trying to play up the things that people would find scary or interesting or timely, or is it trying to do something new or have some sort of form of commentary? I think about, like, you know, the social consciousness of it you discussed. I think about like Alien. You know, Alien is not, as a slasher movie, that's one of my favorites. That's what comes to mind. Alien is in space, but it has all these sort of, you know, Ridley Scott being a weirdo, these sort of psychosexual connotations to all the different, you know, phallic or vaginal things. And so you can read into it, but for the most part, it is, you know, it has this kind of female heroine at the center, but it is doing a lot of the same things that slasher movies do. Scream, obviously very subversive, Cabin in the Woods, you know, very, very, you know, almost parody at a certain point. So I was just wondering, for this particular example, I haven't seen the movie. Does it have those kind of subversive qualities? Is it trying to challenge those conventions at all?
Well, I do read it as being subversive, but oh, geez, is my sound okay?
You're fine, yeah.
Okay, cool. I had a weird echo for a second. I do read it as being subversive, absolutely, but less about challenging the conventions and more about how they're being used in this context. And so it, like, in a longer version of the paper, I situate it within a whole genre of Iranian films called the social issue film, in which basically they try to deal with things that are going on for people. And Nico mentioned Farhadi, and I didn't know the term costumbrism until Nico, so thank you for that. But I do agree absolutely in terms of the sort of like vivid evocation of the particular milieu. Farhadi's films are a very strong example of that. So he would be sort of one instance of somebody like using film to speak to cultural issues, essentially. Something that's important about the social issues film is that, like all films released in Iran, they need to be approved by censors. And so they are allowed to have sort of some level of critique, but that critique needs to be sort of like either tied to a particular instance so that you don't necessarily come away thinking, well, the problem is the system, the problem is these particular people, or it's something that you can kind of put out of your mind. It's like, oh, this clearly doesn't happen every day. This is happening within this movie. And so I read the use of the slasher in this film as very much kind of like allowing that function to sort of like speak to this issue, especially of the dorms not being able to handle all of these new female students, which was a big issue at the time of the film's release. But because it's about, at first you think it's about Jin, and then it turns out to be this crazy guy with a knife, that it was more acceptable, and that this film was released with no problem. It was quite popular. And so I do read that as being quite subversive. And I do some discussion in the longer version of the paper comparing the film with Candyman, which is another film that I read as using the slasher to kind of to speak to social conditions, essentially. And like that film has been read as a sort of repudiation of the slasher kind of just being Reagan, Thatcherite, et cetera. And I read Girls' Dormitory as very much continuing in that tradition.
I can't help but see the kind of like the villainous kind of horror slant to it all, right? It's like Candyman, sure, it's a little bit more interesting in terms of its treatment of race, but at the same time, it's depicting this villainous and interracial relationship, right? You know, Girls' Dormitory, it still ends in violence and has this slasher component. You know, I don't know the sort of, I haven't done a deep dive into the trans subtext of something like Psycho, but there was that whole wave of movies where a man dressing up as a woman, he was the villainous, you know, evil psycho in that context. So I wonder, you know, is the fact that it is a slasher, like it all ends in bloodshed. I need to watch the movie, obviously. I'm speaking, I just wonder.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, yeah, one important part about that is sort of where the evil lies. And in terms of that kind of reading of this film, one thing where I think it more tends in that direction is in the representation of mental illness, because it is fairly uncritical. Like, he's a crazy guy, he goes crazy years ago, and then he kills people, and that's kind of that. But in terms of the treatment of the female characters who receive much more of the screen time, I really feel that it is quite sensitive, and that it sort of sets you up at the beginning with their real excitement about going to university, and you see their back and forths with their parents about whether or not they're going to be allowed to do this. And then because this guy is on campus, they have to go home, and the protagonist gets married pretty much right after that, and her dream of being a student is kind of quashed. So I think you can read some of those kind of reactionary tendencies there, but in terms of the treatment of women in education, I really find it to be quite sensitive.
Cool. I look forward to checking it out.
Max, you have your hand raised. Did you want to ask a question as well?
Yeah, I was hoping to ask a question of Nico. I was curious, you were talking about sort of like discrepancies between different audience members and their relationship with costumbrism, depending on what their particular experiences are. I was wondering about the discrepancies between the relationship of the viewer and the relationship of the filmmaker, particularly since you started with the example of Farhadi. And it's like, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe Everyone Knows was originally supposed to be set in Iran, and then it was only later on that he decided to set it in Spain at all. So I was kind of like struck immediately when you were talking about sort of just like how authentic it felt to you. And so I was wondering if you had any more kind of like reflections on that, just like maybe if a filmmaker's costumbrism is particularly authentic, though it's not necessarily the place that they come from originally.
Yeah, indeed, it was it had a bit of a big mix, the film, because I watched it not being in Spain. It was made by an Iranian director that I had already been seeing films from, that I had in my mind as this particular type of director that made this sort of very costume-based film. So I was really, I didn't really know what to expect. And I think that's one of the reasons why I was so impressed, let's say, because indeed there was also a bit of that, but I didn't indeed reflected on that much, on my relationship with the filmmaker. The idea of like this person that is not living here, but still manages to make this very detailed depiction of the customs and manners of specific area of Spain, the rural way of living. I didn't know about this the fact that he was first intended to do it in Iran. I know that he had just done before film set in France. So I don't know if he was also part of starting to do things abroad. And I do know reading interviews that he moved to an area similar to the one where he filmed for a couple of months, and he was like very annoyingly picking up on everyone, trying to basically like, observed in that way. So yeah, that definitely adds yet another layer of reflection on how the meticulous depiction of something, it I guess doesn't necessarily have to be done by someone that has lived through these things. But then again, this is, if I consider the film as being done by one person, you know what I mean? Of course, he's the director and he's I guess the final authorial voice, but I can imagine there was a lot of consultants and a big team of people also because yeah, after all, he also doesn't speak the language, yet he was directing in a language that he doesn't speak of. So I can understand that there was a good team of consultants assessing to try to be sure that this was made with respect, I guess, or.
Okay, I'm just going to use the opportunity to have Colleen back, apparently relatively stably at the moment, to ask her a question.
Let's not jinx it, thank you. Yes, sorry about all this.
No worries. Just to ask you, because, you know, as you said, you came through French studies and watched the Bizet films originally within the context of being interested in French culture and French film. So what is it like for you watching the Jesus films and to see that kind of nostalgia transplanted into an American setting? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. Thanks. I mean, this is something that came up, especially in working with Wickham, because it was very clear that, you know, like I have nostalgia for these texts that he clearly does not. And I think most of the audience also does not have this kind of nostalgia. So it's very strange to, you know, sort of be one of this minority, very, very distinct minority audience that will know this going in and be able to say, oh, that looks like Going Places, that looks like Blier. And so that's essentially what I brought to my first viewing of the Jesus Rolls, and I hadn't seen the Blier in so long. It just, you know, was this in the original? And which is the original is the other thing. So I mean, it has this very strange, like, sort of bifurcated nostalgia that goes into it. But yeah, I mean, it was, you know, as I think Wickham was saying, like, it's very clear, like, he loves this film and wanted to do something with it. And it's very clear that he loves doing this, I mean, a fan service essentially with, you know, Jesus Quintana. This was sort of a side project for this video essay, but I would love to delve into the French reception of this film, because I think it's pretty clear that this film is still, you know, very much in circulation in France. It's still a national phenomenon, even if, you know, the transnational viewership has clearly dwindled and nobody really knows it. Unless you were there at the time, you don't really follow up on this film. Unless you have that very specific interest, you're not going to know what this is. So I am curious, and that's something that I'd like to do further research on, is, you know, what did they think of this? Because I think it would have played, at least at some smaller film festivals. People would pick up on it. There will be that sort of, you know, cult element to it as a remake of Blier, in addition to its connection to an already cult film in The Big Lebowski. So, I mean, that's sort of a whole other thing that I think is going to be worth studying. The other issue, though, with this particular film is because The Jesus Rolls was released in a very late 2019, it sort of started its public. It was a very long film in filming. We mentioned at the very end of the video that it was filmed in 2017. So it had been written for a couple of years before. It's like basically 5 or 6 years in the making. It took a very long time to get this out there. And then as soon as it starts to become public, the pandemic happens. And now everybody's sort of coming to it through streaming. So we don't have this kind of, you know, unified block of reception to study, unfortunately. But I think that is sort of a next step in this particular project.
Fabulous. That sounds really interesting as a potential future direction of study.
Yeah.
Brilliant. I cannot see that anyone else wants to ask.
I actually had a question, since we're talking about reception. Another question maybe for Nico, especially because you really get this, both the transnational and the national genre issue in there. When you have this sort of film like, you know, Farhadi filming in Spanish and all this, and you have this very transnational team, how much of this is really geared at a certain kind of reception? I mean, what are the limits here that we have? I mean, is this nostalgia maliciously appropriative somehow, you know, sort of in there in order to get viewers and that kind of thing? I mean, this is something that I have a different project that I'm working on with Nuri Bilge Ceylan. Some of you probably know. I think that Costumbrist is a really great term to describe a lot of his work as well, to be very specific about what he's doing in Turkey. And because, you know, his national audiences are so much smaller than his international audiences, there does seem to be a lot of this, you know, costumbrism for export. We might think of it in that way. So is that something that you noticed? Do you think you could elaborate on that again? Like, this is, you know, what are the audiences we're targeting here, and what sort of reception are we looking to get? Because I think this also goes back to Frederick Jameson's idea of the nostalgia film, which he situated very strongly in production, and, you know, putting it into the film very deliberately at that level, where we can look at nostalgia not necessarily just in that construction, but, you know, in the affective response, as your video essay really brilliantly pinpointed. So anyways, about the reception and, you know, who is this for? How is it packaged, etc.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the question, Colleen. And so, yeah, I guess elaborating a bit of, because Max also was asking to this idea how I felt in this relation with the filmmaker, the fact that he's Iranian filmmaker making a very custom-based Spanish film. So I think when I arrived, let's say, at the cinema, I had a bit of, I was a bit skeptical about this, indeed, because of that very reason. The fact that I kind of was waiting for the film to prove that it was not just a mere, like empty nostalgia film, and that he was just not kind of like sporting this style that he used in Iran. I haven't seen the French one though, but the one that I know that he's been doing the production in Iran, and he was just doing it in Spain. And yeah, I mean, on the one hand, yeah, we could say that it's very much directed to the Spanish audience. I can recognize that, because on the one hand, and that's something that I think with the general cinema of Farhadi that he does, is that the costumbrism in his films, I think they kind of comes as imperative, if I can use that term, in the sense of, because the cultural background is very important in the conflict of his films, also for the development of the narrative, to understand the action of the characters. And sometimes how the conflict escalates is based on grounds of religious belief, of cultural background, differences between, in this case of Iran, specific differences between within Iran society. And in the case of Everybody Knows, well, I don't know if everyone's seen the film, but well, the conflict that goes on, it's not that I could recognize it within my family, but I know this sort of conflict and showdowns in smaller villages in grounds of lands and properties and jealousies, let's say. And that is actually what kind of it affords the film to make sense. So I think it was not used in an empty way. At least that's how I perceived it. I can understand that for other people maybe it was the case, but let's say for me it worked. The fact that he used this approach, of course, after all, he's going somewhere else to do something that he doesn't know 100%. But I think, again, heavily relying on a full team, and I guess he just put to use his style of filmmaking in a different place. I think he also had to do a bit of justifying himself in interviews. I read several times how he said that he felt there were a lot of similarities between Spanish society in certain periods and Iranian society as well. So yeah, I think it's definitely there, that issue that you are mentioning.
Thanks.
We have time for one last question, if anyone wants to ask any questions. If not, maybe we can show our appreciation to the speakers for starting us off very, very well this morning. And yeah, Thank you very much, everyone. We have 8 minutes before the next panel start, which means we have time for a toilet break and a tea if we want one. Brilliant. Have a good rest of the conference, and I see you later.
Yes, thank you all very much. It was very cool.